Good afternoon, slightly afternoon. My name is Don Huben. I am the director of the OSU Center for Ethics and Human Values. The Center for Ethics and Human Values is delighted to be able to organize the series of events on research ethics. Too often, I think, discussions of research ethics focus almost exclusively on issues of regulatory compliance, and as important as those issues are, sometimes that focus draws attention away from the underlying values that should guide our research. It tends to incline us to look at the guidelines, the rails, the thou shalt and thou shalt nots, and not spend enough time thinking about how we should chart the best path within those boundaries. Part of the mission of the Center for Ethics and Human Values is to deepen the discussion of practical ethical problems, to draw out the underlying ethical issues that often cut across issues of apparently disparate fields. We see the CARE program as an excellent opportunity to contribute to the fulfillment of this aspect of our mission. We also hope that one of the products of these conversations will be concrete proposals about how institutions can perhaps change the reward structure in ways that promotes more the ethical conduct of research. We have some terrific CARE conversations about research ethics panels planned for the immediate future, beginning with this one, but then in February we have a conversation on reproducibility of research. So if you'd visit the center's website at cehv.osu.edu, if you want to go directly to the CARE program, add a /CARE after that, and look at the events that we have scheduled for the rest of the spring. These conversations wouldn't be possible without support in various forms. First and foremost, the funding for the CARE program comes from the Office of Research, and we are especially grateful to Jan Weisenberger, who is the Senior Associate Vice President at the Office of Research, for her enthusiasm and continued support for the CARE program. The CARE program was really organized by my colleagues Pam Salisbury, who is the Associate Dean for Community Outreach and Engagement for the College of Public Health, and Dana Howard from the Division of Bioethics, which is a department of the Biomedical Education and Anatomy Department. Interesting combination. And we also thank the Bioethics Center for its support for this program as well. As anyone who's organized a program like this knows, it takes people to actually make the logistics work, and so I'm very indebted to Lavender McKittrick-Schweitzer, who is sitting in the back there, and Ali Massoff, who's sitting up here, and the Associate Director for the Center, Steve Brown, who also runs sound and tech and a bunch of other things as well. I want to introduce today's moderator, who is Dana Howard, who I've already mentioned. She is also affiliated with the Philosophy Department in addition to the Bioethics Center. Before joining OSU in these capacities, she was a postdoctoral fellow at the Department of Bioethics at the National Institutes of Health. Her work focuses primarily on ethical issues surrounding medical decision-making, especially the decisions made on behalf of those who cannot make their own decisions. So Dana will introduce our speakers for today and moderate the event. Thanks, Dana.
Thank you. All right, thank you so much for coming, everyone. I am delighted to be here to start off this series with this esteemed panel. Basically, I mean, conflicts of interest have been coming up a lot in the news in the past year. So the New York Times ProPublica investigation recently exposed dozens of leading medical figures who have failed to report their financial relationships with pharmaceutical and healthcare companies when their studies are published in medical journals. And so the sort of prime example of this is Dr. Joseba Selgas, who recently resigned from his position as Chief Medical Officer at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. In September, ProPublica and the New York Times revealed that he'd received millions of dollars from drug and device companies whose fortunes he stood to affect. He also sat on the board of at least 6 companies where his fiduciary responsibilities to them might conflict with the obligations to the Cancer Center. Most of his outside income was not disclosed to the journals in which he published in violation of their requirements. So this is an extreme case, right, of conflicts of interest. But I think it's a useful sort of starting point to think about what really are the issues that sort of, the ethical issues that underpin conflicts of interest. Why does the public care about this? And what is it that we, both as institutions, as researchers, and as a community, ought to do to try and safeguard against the dangers? And I mean, I think that one of the sort of interesting questions as a philosopher that I'm most interested in is what at the heart of the case is the main ethical question. Is this really just a failure of transparency and disclosure? And it's sort of something that we can tweak and make better with better disclosure mechanisms? Or is there something a little bit deeper about some sorts of industry and academic relationships are actually not appropriate or are broken in some potentially interesting, fundamentally deep level? So those are the questions I hope we can talk about, maybe get to. Let me just introduce to you really quickly the panelists and explain how we're going to go through the conversation. So we're very fortunate to have Matthew McCoy, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at UPenn. He's trained as a political theorist, and now he's a bioethicist that studies how public preferences about health and healthcare are represented in public debate and deliberation. And he's particularly interested in the influence of financial conflicts of interest on the behavior of elected and informal representatives who claim to speak for the public in debates about health and science policy. His research combines normative and empirical methods, and he's been published in JAMA, New England Journal of Medicine, and also is a public intellectual and has been published in New York Times, Vox, and Politico. So thanks so much, Matthew, for being here with us. Second, we have Dr. Clark Anderson, who's Professor Emeritus at the Division of Rheumatology and Immunology at Ohio State. He was University Distinguished Professor at Ohio State. He's been known by many as the father of FC receptors. As a philosopher, I'm learning what that is. He's discovered and pioneered research on IgG receptors, and he's been, throughout his career, continuously funded by the NIH for 40 years. And then finally, we're lucky to have Christopher Hadad, who joined Ohio State in 1994 as an assistant professor, has been honored with the National Science Foundation Career Award, and most importantly for this conversation, he has served as representative on the Conflicts of Interest Advisory Board at Ohio State. So he's going to really give us some needed institutional perspective and check our ethical thinking about feasibility concerns. So what we're going to be doing is I invited Matthew McCoy to come up and give a little bit of an overview about the Sloan-Kettering case so that we are all on the same page and we all can sort of start thinking about the issues. And then we sort of as a group came up with some questions that we think are really important to touch upon. So we're going to do that for the first 45 minutes or so. And then we're going to open it up to questions for you for the last half hour. And one thing that I should note is the way we're going to be doing questions is if you go to go.osu.edu/ask, this is in your programs. Whenever there's a question that comes up throughout the conversation, if you just type it up, and we're going to just have a repository of questions. If you see someone else's question that you think is a good one, you could sort of upvote it. And basically, we're going to be asking questions from the audience for the last half hour. All right. Thank you very much.
Thanks for coming. So as Dana said, my goal is not to talk for very long, maybe 15 or 20 minutes. And since our goal is to have a conversation with each other and with you as well, what I'd like to do here is sort of put some things on the table that hopefully will serve as fodder for the discussion. As Dan has said, this issue, as I'm sure most people in here are aware of to some degree, has really been thrust into the spotlight recently with a series of stories that Charles Ornstein and Katie Thomas have been doing for ProPublica and the New York Times. The most sort of central one of these cases has been Joseba Selgas, formerly the chief medical officer at Memorial Sloan Kettering. So this was sort of the first piece that kicked off this series that Ornstein and Thomas are doing, still ongoing. You can see it was published in September 8th. And so just a couple facts from the story in case people didn't read it. So since 2013, Dr. Selgas had served on the boards of at least 6 pharmaceutical or biotech companies. From 2013 through 2017, he had received nearly $3.5 million from 9 different companies. And since 2013, he had failed to disclose industry relationships in more than 100, that should say, articles, or about 60% of the time. So published a lot of articles. It's a good track record. I would like to publish that many in that time span. And didn't disclose industry relationships in a lot of them, despite the fact that he had some pretty significant relationships. So not long after that story was published, about a week later, he resigned his position at Memorial Sloan Kettering. This is his resignation letter. If you want to see it, you can find it online. But I think for the purposes of our discussion here, I think this is the sort of interesting paragraph, because this is where he sort of says what he thinks the problem was. And this goes to the question of, what lessons are we learning from this case, and are they necessarily the same lessons that we ought to be learning from it? So he said that he takes full responsibility for failing to make appropriate disclosures in scientific and medical journals and at professional meetings. He's on his way to updating the record to make sure it's complete. He says, my involvement in a number of pharmaceutical and biotech companies, as well as consulting activities, were reported to and reviewed by MSK. The information was widely available. So there's no sense in the resignation letter that these relationships themselves are something that should have raised questions. Really, the problem, as far as it's framed in the letter, is there was a failure of disclosure, and really the kind of narrow failure of disclosure, in that it wasn't disclosed in these journals and at these meetings. And I think, well, I'll come back to this at the end a little bit. I think in a lot of the initial coverage, that's sort of how this was framed, as a problem with disclosure, as opposed to potentially a larger, more fundamental problem with the way that industry and academia interact. So continuing this series of reporting, Ornstein and Thomas showed that, in terms of executives at major research institutions, Selgas wasn't really an outlier. They found that a lot of other leaders of research institutions focused on cancer had similar appointments on corporate boards, under which they assumed fiduciary responsibilities to the shareholders of those companies, and for which they were compensated in all these cases, several hundred thousands of dollars a year for their board activity. So I'll circle back and talk about this case and the series of reporting a little bit more, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I want to put a couple basics on the table so we have common definitions to work from. So this is the definition of conflict of interest as it was laid out in the Institute of Medicine's 2009 report on conflict of interest. It's sort of industry standard. This is very close to the language that the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors uses. So a conflict of interest is a set of circumstances that create a risk that professional judgment or actions regarding a primary interest, for instance, research integrity, the welfare of research participants, will be unduly influenced by a secondary interest, for instance, financial gain, professional advancement. And this point here is really key, that a conflict of interest doesn't refer to an actual occurrence of bias or harm resulting from the bias. Conflict of interest refers to a set of circumstances that past experience and other evidence have shown poses a risk that primary interests may be compromised by secondary interests. So to say that somebody has a conflict of interest doesn't mean that we have evidence that they've acted in a biased way. It means that they're in a certain set of circumstances or a particular kind of relationship that we have reason to believe poses a threat of bias for them. So why should we care about this? This kind of gets to Dana's point about, what are the sort of ethics of this? Well, I think that a lot of people would agree that researchers and research institutions have an ethical obligation to promote and protect research integrity. Conflicts of interest have the potential to bias researchers' professional judgment. We have evidence to suggest that this is the case. I'll share a bit of that with you in a second. This can lead to biased science, the approval of marginal, ineffective, or unsafe drugs. So the primary reason, I think, to be worried about conflicts of interest is because as researchers, as research institutions, we want to make sure that the research that we're producing is sort of up to the highest standards. So another reason to think about conflict of interest, and this sometimes gets foregrounded, including in this recent editorial in JAMA, is this idea that we're concerned about public trust. And it's important that the public has trust in researchers, research institutions, and the sort of institution of science more broadly. And it is true, I think, that COIs have the potential to diminish public trust in researchers and institutions. But I think that we also have to be realistic that, sometimes loss of trust is justified. If the public is looking at a researcher or a research institution and finding that they do a really poor job managing their conflicts of interest, researchers and institutions aren't entitled to public trust if they earn public trust by making sure that they've taken all the appropriate steps to mitigate any risk of bias, then they're entitled to that trust. But certainly, if you look at the sort of idea expressed here that preservation of trust is the essential purpose of policies about conflict of interest, I don't think that's quite the case. I think the essential purpose is to mitigate and manage this risk, and hopefully that earns public trust for the right reasons. But it's not the case that if there was a whole bunch of conflicts that were unaddressed at an institution, but it hadn't led to any loss of public trust, that we wouldn't have a problem on our hands. We would have a problem on our hands. And arguably, you could say it's an even bigger problem if things are really poorly managed by a researcher or an institution and the public just has no sense of how bad things actually are. That would be a case in which public trust is still high, but conflicts exist. So I'm not going to do a sort of thorough review of the literature here, but just to put on the table some of the evidence that we have about associations between both the personal financial ties of researchers to outcomes and corporate sponsorship of research to outcomes. So this is a study that was recently published in the BMJ. Their objective, as you can see, is to examine the association between the presence of individual principal investigators, which they took to be first and last authors on papers, the association between their financial ties to the manufacture of the study drug and the trial's outcomes. And they controlled for the source of research funding. And they looked at RCTs that were published in core clinical journals for 1 year, for 2013. So this just looks at some of the prevalence of different kinds of financial ties. And for people who haven't done a lot of work in this area, I think this list is sort of helpful to help you see the different ways in which researchers might have financial ties to drug and biopharmaceutical companies. You can see that in their sample, almost 60% of the researchers had some kind of financial ties, and this is the breakdown here. But to get to their core research question, so the interesting finding here is both unadjusted for the source of the funding for the study, whether it's corporate sponsored or not, and adjusted for that. They find that researchers, if first or last author has a tie to the manufacture of the study drug, they're almost 3 times as likely to find positive results in the study. And in a secondary analysis, they controlled for a bunch of other characteristics that might influence this: study phase, sample size, country of first authors, specialty, trial registration, and they found that the association was still there even with those controls in place. So that's looking at the association between personal financial ties of researchers and study outcomes. There's actually a lot more research on the associations between corporate sponsorship of studies and study outcomes. So in 2017, there was a Cochrane systematic review. They looked at 75 different studies that included cross-sectional studies, cohort studies, systematic reviews, meta-analyses that quantitatively compared primary research studies of drugs or medical devices sponsored by industry with studies that had other sources of sponsorship. It's a bit of a busy table, but the sort of essential number to look at is here. They do find that studies are, if they're sponsored by industry, are more likely to have favorable efficacy results. They say the quality of the evidence that they're looking at is moderate, which means that the studies that comprise this systematic review were of decent quality. They have other findings related to harm results. That wasn't statistically significant, and the quality of the evidence was lower. But they also did find a significant relationship between industry sponsorship and studies with favorable conclusions. So we do have evidence of this association, that studies where one of the principal investigators has a tie to the manufacturer of the study drug, and studies that are sponsored by industry tend to have these more favorable conclusions. What are some potential mechanisms for that? Well, there's a little bit less research trying to figure out what the mechanisms of bias might be, but here's a couple different studies that have pointed out or demonstrated the effects of different mechanisms. So one thing is selective outcome reporting, and it turns out that if you compare protocols that are registered before the study is done and then published results, industry-sponsored studies are more likely to have selective outcome reporting, which is to say that when the investigators publish the study, they don't report on all the outcomes that were initially in the protocol. There's also publication bias. It turns out that industry-sponsored studies are less likely to be published if they don't have favorable results than non-industry-sponsored studies. And then there's also favorable interpretation of results. So this particular study, which is a systematic review, found that controlling for different factors that would ostensibly influence one's interpretation of the results. So you have two studies that have similar sorts of findings. If a study is sponsored by industry, it's more likely that the sort of qualitative gloss put on those findings by the researchers is going to be more favorable in the context of industry-sponsored studies. And it's also, this is a non-exhaustive list, and it's also possible, of course, that bias might operate via multiple mechanisms. So getting to the end here, since the question for the panel is disclosure enough? So given these sorts of relationships and given the evidence that we have about their association with study outcomes, what does disclosure accomplish? Well, I think the main thing that disclosure accomplishes is it enables a certain amount of accountability. So in the 2000 IOM report that I referenced earlier, they say, I think quite rightly, that institutional officials cannot evaluate and respond to individuals' relationships with industry if they are not aware of them. So you at least need to have everything out on the table before you can start asking questions, potentially putting in place different management strategies. A recent op-ed in the New York Times, Marcia Angel, former editor of the New England Journal of Medicine, says, well, it does provide some context for people who are reading the studies, but it's not clear that that's always useful to the audiences. As she says, it's simply a way of saying caveat emptor and leaving it to readers to decide whether the research is biased. But most people, even doctors and science reporters, aren't really equipped to make those judgments, particularly when the data are suppressed. Something else that's suggested in the Institute of Medicine report is that disclosure might actually have a kind of deterrence effect, which is to say, if you know you're going to have to disclose certain relationships, you're less likely to enter into those relationships. But of course, that depends on there being some kinds of norms in place where you would be sanctioned for having relationships. If all your colleagues also have industry relationships, then the fact that you have to report yours as well doesn't really have much of a deterrent effect attached to it. It's also important to keep in mind in the context of disclosure that psychological literature has showed that there can be some unintended consequences of disclosure, including the fact that once one discloses, he or she might feel a certain moral license then to act in a more biased way because, well, I've already been honest, I've told you everything that's out there, so I'm not going to sort of self-regulate in the way that I might have in the absence of disclosure. And there's also this phenomenon of strategic exaggeration, which is to say, I disclose my conflicts to you, I expect you to discount my conclusions because of that to some extent, so I'm going to slightly exaggerate to kind of prepare for your discounting of what I have to say. So disclosure does some things, not a lot, and we also have to keep in mind that there can be unintended and unwanted consequences from disclosure as well. So just really quickly getting back to the story that we started with, what's sort of been the fallout from this? What have been the consequences? Well, you can see shortly after the initial story was published, MSK sent an email to their staff saying, "Do a better job of disclosing." So that was the sort of initial fallout, and you can see the chief executive said to staff, that institution and its faculty need to do a better job of disclosing their relationships. Matter of disclosure is serious. And others have also suggested in the aftermath of the New York Times reporting that we need to treat sort of systematic failure to disclose large industry relationships not just as a kind of error, but as serious research misconduct. And it should be treated as such with the sort of penalties that we would attach to that. But so that's one lesson that I think people have taken from this, that we need to do a better job of disclosure. And I think for the reasons that I highlighted here, that's probably not fully sufficient to deal with all the ethical issues that we should be thinking about here. But there is also, I think, some evidence that people are looking at this episode and actually rethinking some of the financial ties that were highlighted and scrutinized in the New York Times reporting. So in January, Memorial Sloan Kettering announced that it would bar top executives from serving on corporate boards, drug and healthcare companies, and a couple of the other institutions that were highlighted in the New York Times reporting have said that they're taking, if not similar steps, at least reviewing whether or not that's something they should do. Dana-Farber, Fred Hutchinson Cancer Center as well. But here's a question about whether or not this is what we should actually be shooting for, and this is something that we can talk about together. This was the recommendation that was included in the 2009 Institute of Medicine report. They say that academic medical centers and other research institutions should establish a policy that individuals generally may not conduct research with human participants if they have significant financial interest in an existing or potential product or company that could be affected by the outcome of the research. So from the slide I showed you a little ways back with all the different principal investigators who have personal financial ties to the manufacturer of the study drug, that's certainly not something that's widely in practice yet. They also say that certain exceptions could be made, but one question is whether or not this should be the standard that we're working for. This is a sort of step along the way, maybe barring executives from holding corporate board positions, but this arguably goes much further. And I think it's worth talking about what the sort of gold standard should be. So I think I will leave it there and look forward to the conversation about this.
I just wanted to give an opportunity for Dr. Anderson and Dr. Hadad to respond. So why don't we first start with Dr. Anderson?
Thanks, Donna. Let me reintroduce myself, because I think I'm not the kind of person that you may think that I am. I'm a specialist in internal medicine and clinical immunology, first of all. Secondly, I have spent my career as a bench investigator, as an immunologist, looking at the frontier of how antibodies work, how we protect ourselves against foreign microorganisms. So I have an elaborate background in research. In addition to my earlier background in clinical medicine. The other thing that I think is pertinent is that when I first began my career, within the first a year or so, I made a couple of very important reagents for my field, monoclonal antibodies. And these were so important. Is it not on? It's in my pocket.
Let's try this one. Let's try. Okay.
So I made a couple of very important reagents that had to be marketed, had to be available for everybody to use them, not only scientists, but patients as well, theoretically. So I collaborated with a couple of my colleagues, and we got together and set up plans for a biotech company to market this, to develop these two reagents. Now, very early on, it was apparent to me that I didn't want to do this really. I wanted to get these reagents out of my laboratory so that I didn't have to worry about them. They could be distributed to whomever wanted them. But I didn't want anything to do with the business. That was going to be a terrible problem for me. So I told them, go ahead and establish the company and run it as you wish. I'm going to stay in the background. I don't want to be involved. I want to be a professor. Well, about 10 or 15 years later, that company was sold to Bristol Myers for $2.5 billion. All right? So I had the opportunity to be part of a $2.5 billion drug company, in essence. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I'm not that kind of a person. I want nothing to do with it. I'm going to be a professor. The other thing that I think is pertinent, so when I tell you that I'm a doctor, I'm not the usual doctor. The other thing that's important is to say that I had lunch with one of your fellow philosophy professors a decade or so ago, with whom I shared my concerns about modern medicine. And his impression was that I was actually a Marxist. So that is what I want to comment on here with regard to Dr. Selgas, and that is, I think that this is a disgrace, Dr. Selgas' activities, that this has no business in modern medicine and modern drug development. What has happened here with Selgas is that the situation has been turned upside down. And in fact, Selgas works, in essence, for the drug companies. And he just happens to have a directorship of a major cancer or medical center in New York City. So I have no patience with this. I can't defend it. I have no sympathy for it. I think it's a disgrace. And I think we've got to deal with that other than simply tweaking it as a conflict of interest problem. I think the other thing that is important for me to say is really the crux of what I need to say is that I think it's a function of our economy. That is, we can't, I don't think you can run drug companies and modern medicine with a capitalist economy. I'm not for this at all. I don't think that all of the decisions that we have to make, all of the priorities that we have to set, I don't think they can be dealt with by a private, by the capitalist for-profit economy. You like that? Fellow Marxists, yes. The other thing I might say is Dr. Marcia Angel's name was mentioned earlier as having written about this topic. She has a wonderful book on drugs in modern medicine written about 10 years ago. Note down her name and go to her if you want any details about the drug influence in modern drug industry influence in modern medicine and modern drug development. Marcia Angel. And I had one last comment that I wanted to make, and that is I think that this, and really I've already done this, and that is I think that this is not an example, Selgas is not an example of conflict of interest. It's an example of our medical system essentially being upside down, and conflict of interest isn't going to be an effective way to deal with this, I don't think. Those are my comments.
Thank you so much. And Professor Hadad?
Well, good afternoon. So my role in this panel is sort of a little different. So I'm a chemist, but in a previous life I was the dean for the Natural and Mathematical Sciences in the College of Arts and Sciences, and I was also the college research officer for about 7 years. And I also sit on the Conflict of Interest Advisory Committee. So as a college research officer, one of the challenges you have is, hopefully you have some goals. One of those goals might be to try to increase the activity of your faculty on being able to get more of their science and scholarship done, which may or may not include writing proposals, which may or may not include involving industry. And the question is, how do you maximize those types of components where you'd like to facilitate the success of your faculty in being all that they can be, to steal an army slogan, while also minimizing the perception of conflicts as well as malfeasance. So my role really in the college, and now sitting on the Conflict of Interest Advisory Committee, is to help the university to keep its name clear and to be able to maximize the productivity of faculty, while also, honestly, one of the challenges we as a university have is when we're state supported and you also get funding from the governor's office. How do you maximize all the different aspects of what the governor might value while minimizing the impact on what the academic mission might want to do over the long term of the discipline versus the short-term decision-making of, say, a four-year governor's office. So those have been my involvements, and I'm certainly delighted to be on the panel, and if I can provide some comment, that'd be great.
Great, thank you so much. So we came up with a few questions that we're going to discuss now, but I will also let you know that the polls are open. So if you go to go.osu.edu/ask, and you have a question, it's going to come to me, and I will voice those questions as they come up. So think about those as we discuss. So basically, I want to sort of piggyback or return to some of the points that have already come up. And the first one is just sort of, in some ways, the first two questions are ground-clearing definitional questions. So the first question is sort of, given the nature of the ethical abuses, especially after Dr. Anderson's testimony, given the abuses, is the term conflict of interest, especially how the Institute of Medicine defines it, really what we're talking about? Or is there some other better term? Should we be thinking in other ways when we think about what the abuses or what the excesses are, what is actually broken? So some things that we came up with is maybe bias. Maybe we should talk about bias rather than just conflicts of interest. Ambivalent goals, conflicted aims. I don't know. Are there better names for the phenomenon, or is conflict of interest exactly the kind of thing that we should be talking about when we're talking about what the abuses are that have come up in the past year or so?
So I think that conflict of interest is still the right term for the phenomenon. I think it's important to make the distinction that a conflict of interest, we don't just want to use the word bias, because in a way that sets the burden of proof too high. In other words, we're not only worried about these sorts of relationships when we have evidence of demonstrable bias. Conflicts of interest, as the IOM I think rightly points out with the definition, are situations that create the risk of bias. And we know that there's a risk of bias because we've seen situations like this in the past. We've done research on them. We sort of know what the associations between certain kinds of relationships and certain outcomes are. So I think the term conflict of interest as a description for the phenomenon is still right. But I agree with Clark that there's a bigger conversation to be had about the sort of academic pharmaceutical complex and whether or not sort of financial motives are driving medical research, driving the delivery of healthcare in this country in ways that they shouldn't be. And if the only sort of tool or critical category that we have to name problematic behaviors in that regard is conflict of interest, then we're either going to be forcing a lot of things into the wrong box or accepting the fact that there's all kinds of sort of problematic things happening that we can't sort of call a conflict of interest and therefore don't have the vocabulary to deal with. So I do think that there's a specific kind of phenomenon which we understand pretty well. It's been well researched, it's been written about a lot. That's a conflict of interest. I also think that there's a larger conversation to be had about industry's influence on academic research and the delivery of healthcare. that needs a broader vocabulary than just this one term. Otherwise, we're really sort of mixing our concepts in a way that's not particularly helpful.
It's my personal feeling. I agree completely. Because I personally think we're biased all the time. I talk with my graduate students all the time, even though it's not my area of research. But we, as scientists, we think about a hypothesis. We collect data. We try to be able to prove or disprove. Honestly, many students like to just prove the hypothesis. Inherently, there's bias.
Right.
So I think that just pervades everything that we do in terms of how we actually do research, because hypothesis-driven research usually likes to get the right answer as coming up with a new hypothesis.
Right. Dr. Anderson?
So I was a big proponent of renaming conflict of interest. I think it's a wimpy name. And I'm for just hollering it right out that this author who puts an asterisk after his name is biased. You must think of him as biased. You must think of everything that he says as potentially biased. And I don't think the conflict of interest people should be able to get by with modifying conflict of interest with potential conflict of interest, as has been the situation over the past couple of decades. So I'm for renaming it and saying these people are biased, and you must acknowledge that. I would also like to see caveat emptor put in place of bias, maybe. Another word for the same thing. That is, let the buyer beware that there's a serious problem here with the recommendations that you're getting from reading this paper or from listening to this physician. As Dr. Hadad says, in my laboratory, I tell my students, don't pay any attention to what the author of this paper says in his discussion or his introduction. Read only the data. Look at the data and analyze the data yourself. Look at the data, assess how the author came to these data by looking at the materials and methods, and then form your own conclusions. Don't believe him don't believe the author because he is inherently biased. I feel strongly about that.
Yeah,
So strongly, I don't have any more words.
well, so that's a good, I mean, this moves to the next question about, one more thing?
Actually, I have another question. I also fight vigorously with my doctors and with my family's doctors. I don't believe them. And fortunately, I'm a physician, an incredibly well-trained physician, so I can understand what they say and I can understand what they are referring to in the database. So I argue with them and I say, you don't know what you're talking about. And I'm going to do it another way. I'm going to find another solution to the problem that I brought to you. I can't trust you. That's unnerving for the physician, of course, and for me as well, because it puts the onus on me now. I have to take care of myself. But I can't trust these doctors to take care of me. I have to do it myself because they're swayed by their own unconscious motivations.
So that's
all.
Yeah, that's really helpful. So I think I want to return to this question about who's bearing the burden of the work on figuring out and mitigating the bias that is present. Are we putting too much? I mean, you are both a doctor and a scientist, right? And so the kind of literacy that you have, you can actually look at the data and make the conclusions.
Right.
But when we think about patients, when we think about physicians in general, that kind of literacy might be really both burdensome and also maybe out of bounds, right? So thinking about how, as a medical community and how, as a research community, we should make sure that the evidence and the sort of research innovations are sort of getting to the right people, right, to the physicians, and also affecting patient outcomes. we should think about like how to deal with this bias, right? So going to thinking about bias, especially given what Dr. Hadad said, you know, one question that, I mean, this is sort of a question about boundaries or what counts as conflicts of interest. So Art Kaplan recently has argued that we focus too much on financial conflicts of interest. There's, as you mentioned, not only sort of the bias of the independent researcher, there's also bias about governmental funding, what is actually being funded. So there's all this potential bias, right, that comes into the research. Should we care about non-financial conflicts of interest, or is it appropriate to focus on financial conflicts of interest? Because that is really at the heart of what the main sort of problems and where what is really problematic about the phenomenon.
So I'm somewhat wary of these efforts to expand our focus, and I think that there are a couple of reasons to have a special focus on financial conflicts. Now, that's not to deny that in principle there are other sorts of factors that could lead to bias. Of course there are, and I don't think that anybody would deny that, but a couple of reasons why I think the sort of current emphasis on financial conflicts makes sense. So one issue with financial conflicts stemming from investigators' ties to the drug and device industry is all these conflicts have the same directionality, which is to say, to the extent that they're introducing bias to approve more drugs, to do a study and find the drug efficacious. That might lead to the approval of more marginal or potentially unsafe drugs. So the drug and device industry, as a potential external influencer on medical research, has a fairly common goal, which is get more drugs approved. Now, individuals, of course, have all sorts of different things that motivate them. You know, we want to be motivated to have a good career and maybe make money. But those biases' influence on the research aren't going to have that same kind of systematic directionality. So there are people who make their careers as sort of professional debunkers, basically questioning the claims that this new cancer therapy that was just approved works really well. People who are sort of in the evidence-based medicine community who are saying, no, you know, your findings aren't actually that good. And so those people might be motivated by some kind of professional advancement goals. The people running the RCTs are motivated by their goals as well. But I think if we're thinking about research as a system and a collective, those sorts of biases are more likely to cancel each other out than is this systematic influence of the drug and device industry, which you saw from some of the figures I put up there. I mean, it's pretty prevalent. In you know, this review of RCTs, they found that almost 60% of first and last study authors that they looked at had a direct financial relationship with the manufacturer of the study drug. I think that's a more systematic source of bias than, well, people have different political views, career ambitions that might motivate them. I think a second thing is that there's been a lot of effort to understand and document the influence of financial conflicts. You saw it in the Cochrane Review. They looked at 75 different studies, including previous systematic reviews that have analyzed this issue. And people have been at great pains to sort of figure out what the dose effect is, how this influence actually translates into research results. If it is the case that other things like desire for fame or desire for money have similar sort of documentable influences on research, like let's do the studies and let's figure out that to actually be the case. I think right now that's sort of conceptually makes sense, but we have a robust evidence base to tell us that financial conflicts of interest are concerning. We have this issue about directionality, and I think there are other issues as well that, without saying that other sorts of bias never matter, they give us sufficient reason to have whatever you want to call it, a kind of special focus on conflicts. And that's not to deny that in the future maybe we want to sort of expand the scope, but I think right now the downside of this effort to just sort of throw everything in there is then when third parties are trying to understand what kinds of conflicts a researcher might have, well, then you just sort of throw up your hands and say everybody's conflicted. And I think that's problematic, because we do know about the effects of this one kind of conflict, and we should take it seriously and highlight it.
Any other responses? So, so let's go to the question of who bears the burden of responsibility for mitigating these sorts of conflicts, and also for figuring out, teasing out what the evidence says, right? So how should these problems be addressed when that arise with conflicts of interest? Is a better disclosure mechanism going to be enough? Who is the primary agent responsible for holding the researchers accountable? We could think about a bunch of different kinds of agents, right? So there's the research institutions, the home institutions of the researchers themselves. We could think of academic journals as really being the gatekeepers, and maybe doing a little bit more due diligence and making sure that the disclosures are actually being done appropriately. We could think about funding sources, right? Especially, federal funding sources or governmental funding sources. So, I mean, in general, I would like to hear from each of you, what do you think the appropriate sort of surveillance mechanisms, sort of accountability mechanisms, you think really would make a difference, and is really needed if we're going to take seriously some of these issues in the future?
Awfully complicated. We have 3,000 plus faculty at the university. If you just went with everybody and having to manage everybody without some sort of a disclosure process, it's just mind-boggling just for Ohio State.
Right.
So my personal feeling, and I've expressed this multiple times on our Conflict of Interest Advisory Committee, it really has to be a local decision, has to be culture shaping, and really for me has three components: research integrity training, research misconduct training, and then the conflict of interest aspect, which is then now financially driven. Mm-hmm. But it really has to be a culture-oriented, what are you educating and you're expecting from every individual? And those should be combined with all of your different values. If you really want to value, say, the interaction of industry with students and the university's research mission, then how are you ensuring that that bias is well described, well managed, and your students don't become pawns of either side?
Can I ask a follow-up question about that? Mm-hmm. So it seems so you're coming from a perspective of how to institutionally make this sort of cultural, this a cultural priority. Do you think in general that's the appropriate, the OSU or the institution is a sort of the appropriate bearer of this responsibility, or do you think that there's potentially other mechanisms that the university could be part of that also bear responsibility for making sure that...
So I think it has to be multiple layers.
Right.
I could see an institution helping to manage some of its conflicts, mm-hmm. but it's difficult to do that because we also manage each other. Mm-hmm. So you always have this issue, whether it's a department chair managing an investigator within a unit, mm-hmm. you want to incentivize that individual to do certain things, but at the same time, you're also their supervisor. Mm-hmm. Okay. Should other institutions manage some of the more bigger conflicts within Ohio State, for example? We've talked once at our Conflict of Interest Advisory Committee as whether the Big Ten as an academic alliance mm-hmm. could almost help to manage some of the issues that Ohio State has, and then we return the favor to them because we all have internal conflicts that are difficult to manage for certain types of things. But for me, it's really, again, some of it's a local, ground up. How do you train researchers to treat data correctly? Mm-hmm. How do you manage the management of that data? What does the data mean? Now one of the challenges, as Dr. Anderson brought up, is you always want your students to be able to look at every raw paper and come up with their own conclusions. But let's be real, it's very challenging when there are thousands and thousands of papers in your respective discipline coming out per week. Mm-hmm. How do you manage all of that to look at things in a critical way? And in particular, if you look at some of these papers, oftentimes they don't provide you the raw data. And there's no way that you can even try to reproduce it because maybe you don't have access to the gene, you don't have access to the actual ability to do that. So for me, it has to come up all the way from training students of all kinds, and also being able to manage how you minimize malfeasance, and how do you catch the people who are either being willfully inappropriate, like happened at Sloan Kettering.
So my comment about that is that we have to change a habit of mind. And we have to look at everything with skepticism. When I was a small boy, I learned on the playground that I interacted with my friends by saying, "What's up?" Asking them, "What are they doing? What's new? What are you doing?" I asked my grandfather at the time, who was about 90, "What's up, Grandpa?" And he said, "My boy, no. I asked him, 'What do you know, Grandpa?' I've told the story wrong. 'What do you know, Grandpa?' And Grandpa said, 'All I know, my boy, is that I know nothing.'" You can tell me where that came from. The point is that we need to approach the world with a skeptical attitude. We can't believe what the doctors say. We can't believe what the scientists say. We have to realize, we have to think through everything that we encounter. And I think that this is kind of a corollary of what we have to do with our society regarding educating them for voting skills. We're hugely deficient in doing both of those things. We give them 12 years of education, but we don't teach them skepticism, and we don't teach them how to select, how to perform at the voting booth. So it's a social problem.
So you top down.
So just to sort of maybe answer it on a bit more of a technical level, focusing on the disclosure problem. So, I mean, this explosive series of stories that they've been doing in the New York Times was, in a way, hiding in plain sight all along. So all they did is look at the disclosures for journal articles published by these figures and compared them to their records in the Open Payments Database, which is something that's been online since 2013. Any doctor, any prescriber, any payments from a drug, device, biotech company to a prescriber are entered into this database, and they're sort of there as a public record. But there are limitations to this. So the only people included in the database are MDs, and now it's been expanded to other prescribers. Database doesn't include PhD researchers and others who are involved in the research enterprise. So you can't use it as a database to audit disclosures of people who aren't doctors. It's also the case that the only companies that have a reporting responsibility are those with at least one product currently on the market that's reimbursed by CMS. So if you have researchers with interests in startup companies who don't yet have a drug on the market, you can't use this database to audit their relationships. So that's all to say, in principle, you could imagine journals, for instance, looking at disclosure forms submitted by authors and having, it's a fairly simple process, having an editorial assistant check those against the Open Payments Database. But there's sort of limits to what you can do with that kind of auditing. You could have that kind of thing go on at the university level, and I talked to some of the research compliance folks this morning, and I know that they do that sort of cross-checking between disclosures to the university and Open Payments Database. But I think because of those limitations, ultimately I would agree with both of my co-panelists. Auditing and sanctioning aren't going to be effective enough to sort of catch and penalize the bad behavior to a sufficient degree that people aren't going to do it. There actually has to be a kind of understanding, real ethical understanding sort of built into the education of doctors and researchers, so they understand why they shouldn't do these sorts of things. And I can only speak from the perspective of Penn, but medical students go through 4 years of medical education, and then when they're on the sort of cusp of going out into their residency, I talk to them for 90 minutes about conflict of interest. And that's their conflict of interest education while they're at medical school at the University of Pennsylvania. Other institutions might do it differently. They might have that be a more sort of robust part of the curriculum. But I don't think that these sorts of research ethics questions are central to the training of a lot of future doctors and researchers. And probably in order to address the problem, we really need to address that.
I should also add one thing, that this open payments database has revolutionized how we look at this process, but there's nothing for engineering or natural science people, because once again, it's all about prescribers and certain slice of the entire industrial interface. Lord knows what we would find if there would be an open payments analog for other types of researchers.
So let me ask one final question before I open up. So thank you. There's been questions that are streaming in. So I didn't notice this about the Institute of Medicine, the sort of gold standard, but it was interesting that it was related to researchers engaged in human subjects, right, and not research more broadly. And I'm wondering if it's important to really make that distinction when it comes to conflicts of interest. Should we really be focusing on making sure that there's on guarding against conflicts of interest when it comes to human subjects? Or is this something that we really should be worried about more broadly when it comes to sort of the negative possible outcomes of conflicts of interest?
To my opinion, as long as it affects the institution's reputation, it needs to be managed. Because if you lose faith, if any member of the public loses faith in how the research enterprise does everything with regard to publishing, then we all stand to lose. So for me, I think it's a much, much deeper aspect, because it's that confidence that's very important to maintain.
From my point of view, there's a whole world out there of biological sciences involved in refining ways of taking care of people that doesn't actually involve taking care of people.
Right.
So I think you've got to include all of the mouse doctors in the world and all of the zebrafish doctors. I think they are all doing biological research that's relevant to health and wellness. So my answer to your question is it's got to be expanded.
Yeah, so I agree with that as well. I think human subjects research introduces an additional level of concern, because we want to protect participants in research, and so we want to protect against risks that would either expose them to more harm in the course of the research or sort of undermine the scientific validity of the study, because then you're asking them to participate in research that has less social utility than it otherwise might. Right. So I think the involvement of human subjects gives us additional reason to be concerned about that, but I think we have sufficient reason to be concerned about it wherever we're involved in the creation of generalizable knowledge through science. So I think there's sort of extra considerations where human subjects are involved, but I agree in principle we ought to be concerned about factors that have the potential to bias other sorts of research. I mean, an institution like this or other research institutions are, stewards of public trust and public money, and they have a responsibility to be responsible stewards of that. And part of that responsibility entails addressing and mitigating risks that might undermine sound science.
If I could add two more quick things on that. So obviously multiple animal models for other types of research sometimes influences a federal sponsor as to what their new program of interest might be, because efficacy has been shown on mice. So it might allow a clinical trial to occur or a research area to be implemented for other types of applications in humans. So that's why you have to make sure all the research has good veracity. But the other part as well is that there are some areas of research where you're using, because I work on organophosphorus chemical nerve agents, the kind of crap that was used in Syria to kill lots of people. Turns out there's something called the 2-animal rule, because when you cannot use human clinical trials, you must use a 2-animal model to show that your compounds or whatever are efficacious in 2 other animals that might be relevant to a human. If you don't ever manage those, there are going to be some things that are going to come through to human tests that you might not have wanted. So for me, it has to be everything.
So I'm going to open it up to questions that people have written and voted on. So the first one is basically weighing the costs and benefits of just having this relationship between industry and funding and research. So the question is, industry funding supports some science which are not on the radar of NIH, NSF. Without that support, the work may not be done. Because researchers have to support their labs, how should we think about the balance of the problem between conflicts of interest against the benefits of the knowledge gained? So we've been really focusing on the bias, on the negative outcomes. How do we sort of measure that against the possible productivity and efficiency gains that come with having all this infusion in research funding?
So, I think it's a good question, and I don't think that even the most vocal conflict of interest critics out there, I don't know of any. I mean, Marcia Angel, who's come up a couple of times already, wrote a sort of very strong op-ed in the New York Times, sort of taking research institutions to task for not doing a better job of managing the conflicts of their faculty and their staff. And even she, who's been quite outspoken about this issue, doesn't say, for instance, that there should be no industry-funded research. She does say that any grants from industry should be strictly hands-off, which is to say that industry sponsors should not have sort of veto decision-making power about whether or not certain results get published. They shouldn't have a hand in study design. Those questions should be left to the investigators. So I think the sort of takeaway from thinking about some of these biases is that we need to eliminate all conflicts. I think the question should be, how do we sort of maximize whatever value comes out of these relationships while minimizing the potential for harm? But I think one benefit of looking at a sort of breakdown, which I showed earlier on the slide, of all the different ways in which faculty might have financial ties to industry is some of those just have no obvious payoff for science at all. And I think that we're a little bit too lenient to say, well, sure, you got some speaking fees, or you went to a lunch. I have a hard time seeing how there's how the cost-benefit analysis in those cases is very difficult. Hard to see what the benefit is, and we know that there's a certain cost to it. So I think the first step is looking at these different kinds of interaction and thinking about, is there potential for benefit in some of them? I think for some the answer is no. For those like industry sponsorship of trials where there is a potential benefit, then I think we need to think about the sorts of proposals that Marcia Angel has made, which is how can we make sure that we capture whatever benefit comes from this funding while minimizing the sort of potential for bias in this research.
Any other responses? So the next question is about whether or not is there actually research on the effectiveness of training programs and the responsible conduct of research? So that is, do we have any empirical evidence that the training programs actually do reduce the incidence of research misconduct? Or is this something that we like to think we do, but it doesn't necessarily show that it has any positive outcomes on?
I don't know if you...
Yeah.
So I think this is a real problem. And this is actually something that I'd like to work on, and I know colleagues would like to work on. I mean, a lot of the things that we do in terms of training, I mean, we have good sort of theoretical justifications for why they might help in this regard. But I don't know of any, say, randomized trial where this cohort of trainees gets this kind of training, this cohort doesn't. And then we sort of track them long term over the course of their career to see if those who are exposed to a certain kind of training intervention actually do better in this regard. And something like that might be actually hard to put together. But I do really think that we need to do a better job of kind of testing the effectiveness of different conflict of interest policies.
So I think it's doable, mostly because I don't know how many years now the NIH has required this. but when they have a T32 training program, which is both grad students as well as postdocs, they have required responsible conduct of research in-person training for a number of years. What I don't know is how many years going backwards. I know it's at least 4. But in principle now, if one could monitor that cohort, and it is also applied to the F series, which has been pre-doctoral trainees on a single, as compared to a training grant, those have been required now for a number of years. So one could go through longitudinally, since almost everybody else got no training. These folks did get training. Can you actually look to see whether there are less research misconduct issues with a class versus another? I think it's an interesting study. There's honestly just no analysis that I know of, but I think it's possible to do that, especially with the data analytic tools that are now available.
And there's a real question about how kind of sensitive you could make the analysis. So, one outcome you could track is research misconduct, occurrences of research misconduct. But a lot of the things that we're worried about in financial conflict of interest fall short of ever being sort of flagged as research misconduct. And those would be a lot harder to capture. But given the case that the evidence base is so thin right now, even just looking at something like research misconduct, I think would be useful.
So the next question is, so sometimes scientists claim they have no conflict of interest because they're taking money from multiple competitor companies. So someone doing an RCT for a new cholesterol lowering medication is a consultant not only for this company, but for all these others. What do you guys think about that? Is that one solution that we haven't thought of that could mediate some of these problems?
I say no, it makes it worse.
How does it make it worse? What do you think?
When somebody has such a large contribution from multiple entities, for me, it just maximizes the perception that everything that they've now done could be massively biased. Like I said, I think bias exists at all points in time. But when you now have your hooks into every possible pot that's out there, it just seems as though you have just massive challenges. So it just raises so I'm a born skeptic. I agree with Dr. Anderson on that as well. So I always come into things with the expectation that a good degree of cynicism and skepticism is a good thing. And the key is to minimize malfeasance and loss of reputation to the individual, to the university, as well as to whatever that sub-area of the university might be. But for me, it just gets worse when you have your hands in every pot.
Yeah, I would say that an investigator who gives you that response to that question has a severe deficiency in self-awareness and simply doesn't know what he's about. There is an inherent skepticism that has to be maintained by all people who are investigators or taking care of patients about where their data are coming from and how they're making decisions about how to proceed. If they're not aware, if they're not skeptical of the advice that they're giving, they're not doing their job. They're not being adequately self-reflective. I think one of the example that comes to mind, and I'm not quite sure that it's perfectly appropriate, but one of them has to do with the number of the number of joint replacements in a community is dependent upon, I'm told by the people who do surveys, is dependent upon the number of orthopedic surgeons in the neighborhood. Think of that. If you go to an orthopedic surgeon and you say that, and he tells you that you could profit from a hip operation, you have to consider the law of Midas muffler. That is, if you go to a Midas muffler place, they're apt to give you a muffler, even though you may not need a muffler. If you go to an orthopedic surgeon, he doesn't think about whether you necessarily need a bone a joint. He's used to doing that. He'll hit the nail with whatever tool he has without reflecting. We know that because of these surveys, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
So one of the questions is thinking about this more systemic issue. So is the primary incentive for if the primary incentive for pharmaceutical companies is to finance research for the approval of their drugs, are we too focused on conflicts of interest? And really what we should be attending to is the laxity in FDA approval. So that's where, you know, sort of the more important changes need to be made.
I think yes, but that's not an either or. So we ought to do both. And, you know, financial conflicts arise in the FDA as well. So there's been research done. I've done some of it with colleagues at Penn that look at financial conflicts of both members who sit on drug advisory committees for the FDA, the quote-unquote members of the public who show up to deliver testimony at those advisory committee meetings. A lot of people with financial conflicts showing up, and did I go dead there?
We're dead.
We're dead. Speaking at these drug advisory committees, other people have done research sort of looking at people. So advisory committee members are technically external to the FDA, but people within the FDA also sort of come in and out of industry.
Right.
There's questions about, obviously, the standards that the FDA has. So absolutely, all of those are questions that are sort of worthy of consideration. But I don't think it's a sort of zero-sum game where we have this finite amount of energy and we either invest it in conflict of interest or rethinking the way that the FDA does drug approval. I think that, you know, both are places where we should be working and thinking about how we can improve.
The way I think of it is pharmaceutical companies, just like any lobbyist, is trying to maximize their effectiveness in making money per unit time by controlling the people who help them to make money per unit time. That's the FDA for a pharmaceutical company. That's a pick on Boeing or Northrop Grumman trying to convince the Department of Defense that they should buy some more F-35s. Everybody's trying to figure out from the company point of view how to maximize what either their shareholders will value or their reward structure will value. That does not mean the university has to be complicit in that optimization. And we have to figure out how to be able to maximize the benefit to the patient and to the members of society, despite that they're trying to game the system for their advantage.
Right. I think the FDA is crooked. And the FDA is regulated, I think, by Congress, is it not? Or by the federal government? Other departments in the federal government? And there's the largest lobby, I understand, in Washington is that of the drug companies. So the drug companies lobby Congress to regulate the FDA to make it permissive for them to sell drugs with mediocre efficacy and also dangers. You can't trust them. How do you make it better? Well, I go back to my original economic orientation.
So one final question that we should, that has gotten a bunch of votes. So the evidence presented focused on COI on the part of the study authors. So to what degree are conflicts also a problem in the peer review process and on the part of the study debunkers? And are there procedures in place to address these sorts of issues? So in the sort of background workings, is there any sort of mechanism to address issues of conflicts of interest for people that are doing the blind review or editorial boards that are writing sort of the editorial when a big sort of study comes out? Those sorts of questions.
So I don't know where every major medical journal stands on this now, but I think the sort of big ones, I don't know if uniformly, but fairly commonly now have the policy that at least those people who are invited to write in editorial when a big RCT gets published are supposed to be free from conflicts related to the manufacture of that study drug and also competitor conflicts. So, you know, a financial interest in a company that makes a competitor drug. As far as, you know, peer review, I don't know of research into this as somebody who does peer review. You know, you're asked to disclose any potentially disqualifying conflicts. But again, we're running into the problem there that it's basically self-reporting, and there's, in principle, if a peer reviewer is an MD, somebody on the editorial staff could check her disclosures against what's in the open payments database. But I think that the sort of limited tools at the disposal of editors are sort of the same for peer reviewers that they are for study authors. I mean, I do wholeheartedly agree with the policy that somebody invited to write an editorial about an RCT should be free from financial conflicts, because a lot of non-experts, you know, you're I think right to insist that your trainees sort of dig into the data and look at the table. But the average person who sees the story, or, you know, the trial written up in the New York Times and maybe wants to go and look at something about it, they're not going to read the study, they're going to read the editorial, which sort of explains in common sense language what it means and what the upshot is. And that goes for not just lay members of the public, but a lot of policymakers who sort of work in healthcare but aren't experts on randomized control trials. So I think there, you know, I wholeheartedly agree with the policy that those who are invited to write the editorial should be free from conflicts. As far as, you know, what's being done in peer review, probably not much. But again, I think outside of sort of greater forthrightness on the part of peer reviewers, I'm not sure how much journal editors can do. They just don't have any sort of database that would let them externally validate a lot of what people self-report.
So I agree with all of that, but you got to keep in mind as well, depending on discipline, the peer review process works completely differently. For example, in chemistry journals, it's never blind. The reviewers, who are obviously selected by the editors, one's hoping that the editors do a very good job of doing that selection. But the reviewers always know who the actual authors are. In some other journals, everything is blinded. It's not done in many science journals. And of course, thinking about who's going to be reviewing your papers, do they agree with what you're trying to do for your NIH grant that's currently in review? There's bias in all possible aspects, and it's embedded in the process. And I think the part that actually I struggle with the most recently, and it's been pervasive in chemistry journals, but I presume it's across many, many different journals, is how many open access journals have been popping up where you just simply pay a fee and your paper gets accepted. So the review process there is very, very minimal, if not completely biased, because they just want as many papers to get accepted, because that's how their financial model is being done. And I think that's a huge problem with the entire publication enterprise. Because, you know, for example, we have the American Chemical Society, which in my opinion has extremely good standards for what papers should and should not be published. But they now also have an open access arm that competes with their regular arm that's now a financially driven model. It's very complicated, and I personally have decided not to publish in anything that's an open access journal, period. That's it. I can't imagine younger faculty will want to do that, because they might get rewarded at promotion and tenure time because their chair likes how many papers they've published, even though it might have gone through a relatively non-rigorous review process.
Right.
But it erodes confidence, in my opinion.
So I can tell you a relevant anecdote. I'm in the final stages of writing an expose of a paper, a series of papers describing a drug that members of my family might use. I think the drug is bogus, but the description of the drug appeared in the world's greatest, most famous, most illustrious medical journal. And it was approved by two editorials, one of whom was had a conflict of interest by the company that made the drug. Incidentally, all of the authors had conflict of interest. The drug was written up in 3 or 4 papers published over a period of about 5 years. It was approved by the FDA, and it was approved by the European FDA, the EMA, and it received about 7 independent reviews, independent in quotation marks, by authors who had a conflict of interest with this same drug company. So in essence, it hadn't been reviewed by anybody. So I reviewed it myself, put my own talents on the line here, and said this is a bogus drug. Now, that's the end of the story. I can't tell you the punchline because I haven't published this yet. I think it's going to be published. But the point is, in essence, fabricated story survived the reviewers of the greatest medical journal of all time, survived the reviewers of the FDA and the EMA, and is being given to patients. And yet, a sophisticated reviewer can find obvious holes in it and conclude that this is a bogus drug. So the system doesn't work. We're driven by profit, we're driven by money, and that's not going to keep us healthy and well. Now, I don't know that I can bend my interests to figuring out how we can do this as capitalists. You'll have to tell me.
Well, so I want to thank the panelists for a really vigorous and, I think, thought-provoking panel. And as a political philosopher, I love always asking whether our economic system is actually like an appropriate way to live as humans and to create knowledge. So I think that it's always a welcome question when we're thinking about these issues. So please, everyone, thank the panelists for their time.